What DNA just proved about where Black America really came from? What if the origin a slave ledger swore was lost forever has been sitting inside a cheek swab this whole time? Somewhere tonight, a Black family gathers around a kitchen table, and a small screen glows back at them with a word their grandparents were never allowed to say out loud. A region, a coastline, a people with a name, where the old paper record said only one cold word, unknown, a 2020 study, and a plain swab of the inside of your cheek. Now hand back something specific, not a feeling, a place on a map. And I want to be honest with you from the very first minute, because this is a subject where honesty matters more than heat. Here is the question I keep turning over, and I want to turn it over with you, not at you. What if the erasure was never total? What if the men who kept those ledgers, who worked so hard to blank out where a person came from, missed something they could not reach? They could burn a name. They could forbid a language. They could write a port of sail where a homeland used to be. But there were things carried across that ocean that no clerk could edit. That is not a claim about destiny. That is a claim about records, and records can be checked. And I promise you before this is over, we are going to check them together, one by one, in the open. So, I'm going to bring 3 of them into this room tonight, and I'm going to lay them side by side. The first is a genetic study published in 2020 in a peer-reviewed medical journal that reported where African American ancestry largely traces back to. The second is a database of the slave ships themselves, tens of thousands of documented voyages, with the regions of departure written down by the very people running the trade. And the third is older than both. It is a line from an ancient Greek manuscript of the Bible, the Septuagint, in the book of Amos, chapter 9, verse 7, that named an African people long before any ship set sail. Think about how different those 3 witnesses are. One is a scientist with a sequencing machine. One is a slave trader with a quill and a profit motive. One is a Greek scribe, copying scripture before the time of Christ. They lived in different centuries. They spoke different languages. Not one of them was trying to help the family at that kitchen table find their way home. And that is exactly what makes their testimony worth hearing. Witnesses who cannot have coordinated, who had no reason on earth to agree, are the kind of witnesses a careful person actually trusts. Read one of them alone and you can shrug. Read all 3 together, and something happens that I've sat with for a long time. They start to agree. Not perfectly, not like a courtroom confession, but like 3 strangers who never met, describing the same street. I'm not going to tell you your blood decides who you are. I don't believe that, and I won't say it. What I believe is quieter, and honestly harder to erase. There is a pattern here, and the pattern only shows up when you stop looking at one witness and start reading all 3 of them together. Stay with me, because by the end I think you'll see the same thing I did, and I don't think you'll be able to unsee it. Let me show you what the middle passage was actually built to do, because most people picture only the chains. The chains were real. But there was a second machine running alongside the chains, and it was quieter, and in some ways it did deeper damage. It was the machine of erasure. When a person was carried onto those ships, the goal was not only to move a body across water. The goal was to end a story. The name was stripped and replaced with whatever the buyer chose. The language was forbidden, punished, beaten out over a generation. And the home region, the actual village, the actual coastline a person could have pointed to, was overwritten with a single line on a bill of sale, the port where the human being was unloaded and priced.
I have sat with that for years, and it still knocked the wind out of me. Think about what it means to lose the answer to the simplest questions a human being can be asked. Where are you from?
A child born into slavery in Virginia in 1800 could not answer it. Their mother often could not answer it. 2 generations back, the answer had already been deleted on purpose. Not by accident, not by the slow fog of time, but by design. That is the part people miss. Forgetting happens on its own. This was not forgetting. This was a deliberate scrubbing, repeated so consistently across so many lives that the blank became the normal state of things. And I want to be careful here, because this matters more than anything else I'll say tonight. It was not a race that did this. It was a system, a trade, and the cold bookkeeping that served it. That distinction is not me going soft. It is me being accurate. The evil here has a shape, and the shape is a business built to convert people into cargo and erase the evidence of where the cargo began. Investors funded it. Insurers underwrote it. Clerks recorded it. When you attack the system instead of a people, you can actually see the machine clearly, and seeing it clearly is the only way anything gets healed. That is the wound. Now here is the strange mercy hidden inside it, and it is the reason this video exists. That same trade, that same obsession with paperwork, left behind a paper trail. To buy and sell human beings at industrial scale, you need records. You need manifests. You need to log the ship, the captain, the port of departure, the port of arrival, the numbers, because money moved on those numbers. And those records, kept for the ugliest reason imaginable, survived. They sat in archives and shipping offices and insurance houses for centuries. Today, the largest collection of them lives in one place, gathered and digitized. It is called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, and you can open it yourself tonight at slavevoyages.org. Many careful historians have poured decades into building it. Look at the scale of what it holds. The database documents on the order of 36,000 individual slaving voyages. 36,000. Sit with that number. Each one a ship. Each ship a hold. Each hold full of people who had names the ledger refused to keep. Historians who study these records estimate that somewhere around 12.5 million people were forced onto those ships across the whole span of the trade. I say estimate, and I mean estimate, because these are scholarly reconstructions built from incomplete records, not a perfect census, and honest historians will tell you the same. But the direction is not in doubt, and the scale is staggering by any reading. And here is the detail that will matter for everything that follows, so hold on to it. Those records often name the region of embarkation, not just a random African coast, but name stretches of it. Senegambia, up along the rivers of the far west. The Bight of Benin, that great curve of coast. West Central Africa, the long shoreline that runs down toward the Congo and Angola. The traders wrote these down because it mattered to their business where a ship had loaded. They had no idea they were preserving in cold commercial shorthand the very thing their trade was designed to erase. And I want you to feel how ordinary those entries look on the page, because that is part of what makes them so heavy. A region, a number, a date. No horror in the handwriting, no trembling in the ink. Just a clerk doing his job, logging where a ship had loaded the way a shopkeeper logs a delivery. The men who wrote them would be stunned to learn that a descendant, generations later, would open their bookkeeping not to trade, but to grieve and to find. I've come to believe there is a quiet justice in that, though I say it as my own conviction, and not as a fact I can hand you. Hold on to those names, because you are going to hear them again from a completely different witness. That is the whole method of this video, and I want to lay it out plainly so you can hold me to it. I am not asking you to trust one source. I'm going to bring 3 independent records to the table. The ship ledgers, kept by the traders, the DNA studies run by geneticists in this century, and the manuscript reading, older than both, preserved in an ancient African Bible. 3 witnesses who could not have coordinated. And I want to watch, with you, whether they point the same direction, and how far the agreement really goes. Now let me be crystal clear about what this is, and what it is not, because we are in tender territory, and I will not blur it. This is evidence about ancestry and geography. It is a question of where people came from, and how we know. It is not a claim about anyone's soul. It is not a claim about your destiny, or your worth, or some secret spiritual rank that DNA supposedly hands you. I don't believe DNA does any of that, and you will never hear me say it does, not even at the emotional peak of this video. What these records can restore is something smaller and, to me, far more precious. An address, a region the ledger tried to blank out. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I'm going to open that first witness, the 2020 study, and show you exactly what the researchers reported, in their own careful language. And then I'm going to lay it next to the ships. This is where the pattern starts to breathe. Don't drift off now. The first record is where the whole thing begins to turn. And once it turns, I don't think it turns back. Let me bring the first witness to the table, and let me name it precisely, because precision is the whole point on a subject like this. In 2020, a study was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. That is a peer-reviewed scientific journal, which means other geneticists checked the work before it ran. And that detail is not a footnote. It is the reason the study carries any weight at all. The title tells you exactly what it set out to do. It was called Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the Americas. The lead author was a researcher named Stephen Micheletti, working with colleagues connected to the consumer genetics company 23andMe. And the reason this one lands so hard is the sheer size of it. The researchers reported drawing on data from roughly 50,000 participants across the Americas, Africa, and Europe. 50,000. Let that number sit for a second, because scale is what separates a strong study from an anecdote. It is one thing for a single family to get a result and wonder. It is another thing entirely when researchers gather data from tens of thousands of people, run it through the same methods, and report a consistent pattern across all of them. That is not a hunch. That is not a story someone wants to be true. That is a large, checked, published body of data. And on a subject that has been drowned in guesswork for 200 years, having actual numbers on the table changes the whole conversation. I want to slow down and say clearly what kind of claim I am making here, and what kind I am not, because this is exactly where people overreach. I am telling you what a study reported. I am telling you what the researchers concluded from their data. I am not standing here saying the science has spoken and the case is closed forever. That is not how honest people talk about genetics, and it is not how I want to talk to you. Studies get refined, samples get bigger, reference maps improve, and conclusions shift with them. But when a large, peer-reviewed study reports a clear pattern, that report is worth putting on the table and reading carefully. And this, for many of us, was the thing we had waited a long time to see finally put into numbers, instead of longing. So what did they actually report? Here is where you lean in. The 2020 study reported that for African Americans, the bulk of the African ancestry it measured traced back to West Africa and West Central Africa, not a vague, blurred continent. Specific stretches of it. The data suggested strong connections to the very regions the historians had already been naming from the ship records. The researchers pointed toward Senegambia, toward the Bight of Benin, toward the Bight of Biafra, and down into Congo and Angola along that west-central coast. The data suggested these were not scattered, random origins. They clustered. They pointed somewhere. The study reported other things too, harder things, that I won't rush past. Researchers reported patterns in the DNA that lined up with the brutal particulars of the trade. The way certain regions were more heavily represented in certain parts of the Americas. The way the sex ratios and survival of the trade left their mark generations later. The data, as they read it, carried the fingerprint of history, not just geography. I hold all of that as reported findings offered by scientists who checked each other's work, not as my personal verdict on anyone. And I keep hedging my language on purpose, because I want you to hear the difference. I am not saying the swab knows your village. I am saying the researchers reported that, across tens of thousands of people, the ancestry pointed overwhelmingly toward a set of named African regions. The data suggested a shape, and here is what stopped me the first time I read it. That shape looked familiar. I had seen those region names before in a completely different kind of document, written by completely different hands, for a completely different and far uglier purpose, which is exactly where we are going next. So let me put the two documents next to each other, because this is the moment the room gets quiet. On one side of the table, the 2020 genetic study, run in this century by scientists with sequencing machines, reporting that African American ancestry traces largely to Senegambia, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa toward Congo and Angola. On the other side of the table, the slave ship database, built from manifests written 2 and 3 centuries ago by the traders themselves, naming those same stretches of coast as the regions of embarkation. 2 records, 2 centuries apart, 2 completely different reasons for existing. Think about how strange that agreement is. The people who wrote the ship ledgers were not trying to help anyone find their way home. They were logging cargo for profit. The scientists who ran the 2020 study were not reading old slave manifests to decide where to look. They were reading DNA in a laboratory.
Neither one was checking the other's work. Neither one had the other's document open on the desk. And yet, when you lay the reported generic regions over the documented embarkation regions, they overlap. I have sat with that overlap for a long time, and I still find it moving.
2 witnesses who never met, who had no reason to agree, describing the same coastline from opposite ends of history. Let me make the logic of that plain, because it is the beating heart of this whole video. In any courtroom, in any investigation, in any field of study, the strongest kind of evidence is when 2 independent sources agree without collusion. If one witness could have copied the other, their agreement means little. But if 2 witnesses had no contact, no shared motive, no way to coordinate, and they still tell the same story, that agreement is worth something real. That is what we have here. A slave trader's ledger and a geneticist's dataset, separated by 200 years, and every possible barrier pointing at the same African coast. Now I have to be careful, and you would want me to be. Overlap is not a perfect one-to-one map. The regions are broad, not pinpoints. A genetic estimate is a probability, not a birth certificate. The historians would tell you the trade moved people around, mixed origins, blurred edges, that a person loaded at one port might have been marched there from far inland. All of that is true, and I'm not going to pretend it away to make a cleaner story than the evidence supports. But the honest reading, the careful reading, is that 2 independent records built by different people for different reasons are pointing in the same direction. And in any other field, when that happens, we do not call it luck. We call it corroboration. But it gets deeper. Because 2 witnesses is strong, and 3 is something else entirely. So before I bring in the 3rd, I have to draw one hard line, and I want to draw it out loud where you can hold me to it. Here is what this does not mean. It does not mean your DNA carries a memory. It does not mean a swab holds a spirit, or a covenant, or a rank in heaven. DNA reports geography and ancestry. That is its lane, and it is a narrow one. It tells you with real limits, roughly where your people came from. It does not tell you who you are, what you are worth, or what you were made for. I don't believe your blood proves who you are, and I will not sell you that, not even to make a bigger and more moving story. So let me tell you what I do believe the science restores, because it is smaller and truer, and it will outlast any hype. It restores an address. That's it. That's the whole gift, and it is enormous precisely because it is so specific. Where a ledger once wrote unknown, a study can now report a region. Where a family had a blank on the one line that mattered, there is now a coastline with a name. That is not destiny. That is dignity, and that dignity is exactly what the trade tried hardest to erase, which tells you how much it was worth. Hold that line with me, because we are about to add the second body of evidence, and the pattern is going to get harder to explain away. Now let me bring in the second witness, and this one has a name and a face, because a man built it on purpose. His name was Rick Kittles, a geneticist, and back in the early 2000s, he co-founded a project called African Ancestry. When I first read about his work, what struck me was not the technology. It was the intention behind it. Here was a black scientist who understood the wound personally, who knew that families had been handed a blank where a homeland should be, and who set out to build a tool aimed straight at that blank. The 2020 study I just showed you was massive and broad. 50,000 people at once. African ancestry was something else. It was personal. One lineage at a time. One family reaching back into the silence. Let me explain how the method works, in plain language. Because the how matters if you are going to trust the what. Every one of us carries two kinds of ancestry markers that pass down almost unchanged along a single line. One is passed from mother to child to child to child. The maternal line, carried in what scientists call mitochondrial DNA. The other passes down the paternal line, father to son, carried on the Y chromosome. Those two lines are like threads that run backward through the generations without getting shuffled much, which makes them useful for tracing deep origin. African Ancestry, as the company reports it, compares those markers against a large database of samples gathered from present-day African populations. Here is what that comparison does, in everyday terms. When your maternal marker closely matches samples from a particular region or people group living in Africa today, the company reports that as your likely maternal origin. It is, in essence, a matching game against a reference library of the living. You hand them a thread, and they look for where that thread still runs today. And when it comes back with a name, a people, a region, for a family that has held only the word unknown for 200 years, that name can land like a door opening in a wall that never had one. And here, I have to hedge hard, the way an honest guide should, because this is exactly where excitement can outrun the evidence. What the company reports is a match, and a match is a probability, not a certificate. It depends entirely on how complete the reference database is, and on how those markers happen to travel through history. I've read the careful critics, and they make fair points that I won't hide from you. Two people from the same village can get slightly different reads. A single lineage marker only traces one thread out of the thousands of ancestors standing behind you. A region can sometimes be reported with more confidence than the underlying data really earns. So when I tell you African Ancestry reports a lineage tracing to, say, the Balanta of Guinea-Bissau or the Tikar of Cameroon, hold it the way the scientists themselves would want you to. As a strong, probabilistic pointer, not as the final word carved in stone. But now notice what is happening, even with all those cautions stacked up in plain view. A second, independent effort, built with a different method, working one family line at a time instead of 50,000 at once. Funded and run by different people with different tools, keeps landing in the same neighborhood. West Africa, West Central Africa, the same coast the ships named in their ledgers. The same coast the 2020 study reported in its data. I keep using that word, reported, on purpose, so you never once mistake a probability for a prophecy. But two different bodies of genetic work, reaching for the same blank from two completely different angles. Keep pointing at the same map. And the map itself was about to get sharper, because the reference library these tools depend on was quietly getting better. Here is why the second half of the 2010s changed the picture. And it is worth understanding, because it is the reason these region reports got sharper instead of vaguer. For a long time, the great libraries of human genetics were thin on Africa. Enormous efforts had mapped European and Asian populations in fine detail, funded lavishly, sampled deeply, while the most genetically diverse continent on Earth, Africa, was left underrepresented. Think about the irony of that. The birthplace of the entire human family was the part of the map with the least detail. Around 2016 and the years surrounding it, a wave of African genome sequencing efforts began to close that gap. Researchers reported adding many more African populations to the reference maps that ancestry studies lean on. And a richer reference map does something simple but powerful. Think of it like this. If your library only holds photographs of 10 African towns, the best you can honestly say about a person is that they look like they came from one of those 10. Everything else gets rounded to the nearest picture you happen to have. But if the library adds hundreds of towns, suddenly you can say something finer, something closer to the truth. The 2016 era work as researchers reported it. Let studies resolve African ancestry at a higher resolution than before, distinguishing between regions that older, thinner maps had smeared together into one vague blur. That is not the machines becoming magical. That is the reference library finally getting full enough to tell neighbors apart. I want to hold the guardrail steady here, because a better map can tempt people to overclaim, and I've watched it happen. A fuller reference library narrows the estimate. It does not make it absolute. It moves a report from I think it is somewhere in West Central Africa towards something like the coast around the mouth of the Congo, which is genuinely more useful and more moving. But it is still an estimate riding on a probability. I've come to believe the honest posture is gratitude without inflation. We know more than we did 10 years ago. We do not know everything, and we may never. Both of those are true at the same time, and a careful person can hold both without letting go of either. Now let me take all of that out of the lab and put it back at the kitchen table, because that is where it actually lands, and where it actually matters. A grandmother in Baltimore opens an envelope with hands that have folded a lot of laundry and buried a lot of people. A grandson in Houston turns his phone toward his father, both of them suddenly quiet, and on the screen is a word the family Bible never held. Cameroon, Congo, the Bight of Benin. For generations, that same family Bible recorded births and deaths and marriages, faithfully, lovingly, in careful cursive, on the front pages. And yet, on the one line that asked where before America, there was nothing. A silence 2 centuries deep. And now, next to that old silence, a region with a name.
I don't have language big enough for what that does to a person, so I would just tell you what I have seen with my own eyes. I have seen people go quietly, completely. I have seen the strong one, the one who never cry, the Parthians and the Martians, put a hand over their mouth and turn away for a second, because something that was stolen so long ago that it stopped even feeling like a thief, it's suddenly partly back on the table.
And if you have felt that, or watched someone in your own family feel that, I want to know where you are watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments, and if this is landing on you, leave one word. The word that carries this whole video. Leave the word pattern. I want to see how many of us are sitting with the same recognition at the same time, in the same hour. Because here is where the second witness finishes its testimony, and it is not a small one. It is not one study standing alone. It is 2 independent bodies of genetics research, the broad 2020 study of tens of thousands, and the lineage by lineage work of African ancestry reaching into single-family lines, plus the sharper reference maps of the late 2010s, all reporting the same regional story. And that story sits right on top of the SHIP database. 3 records now, not 1. And I keep asking myself the question I want to ask you directly. At what point does agreement between strangers stop being a coincidence and start being a pattern? Stay with me, because the historical echoes come next, and they are going to make that pattern almost impossible to unsee. Let me take you down to the water, because the numbers we've been talking about were once wooden ships on a real coast, and I don't want them to stay abstract. Open the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database and pick a single voyage. Just one, out of the tens of thousands it records. When I first did this, I sat there a long time, because the entry is so ordinary, so administrative, and that ordinariness is its own kind of horror. A ship's name, a year, a flag, a captain listed by name, a man with a family somewhere, and then the 2 lines that break your heart once you understand what they mean. Region of embarkation, port of disembarkation. The database records that region of departure for many tens of thousands of these voyages, which is exactly why it can speak to our question at all. So picture it with me, slowly. A vessel riding at anchor off the coast of West Central Africa, near the mouth of the Congo, where the brown river water pushes out into the sea and stains it for miles. The heat sits on everything. The smell of the coast, the sound of the surf against the hull. On the deck, a clerk with a ledger writes down a number, not names, a number, because to the paperwork, these are units of trade. Weeks later, after a crossing that killed many of them, The same ship ties up at a wharf in Charleston or in Virginia. And another clerk writes the port of arrival, the count that survived, the price the market would bear that season. 2 entries, months, and an ocean apart, bracketing a horror the ledger itself never bothers to describe. But between those 2 lines is a real coastline and a real people, written down almost by accident. The trader did not mean to preserve anyone's heritage. He meant to track his investment. And yet, in tracking it, he recorded the where. He recorded that this ship loaded here, on this named stretch of African coast, and unloaded there, at this American port. Multiply that by tens of thousands of voyages, and you do not have a story anymore. You have a map. A vast, grim, accidental map of where a whole people were taken from, drawn by the very hands that took them. Here is the cold logic I want you to sit with, because it is the engine of the whole erasure, and if you understand it, you understand everything. A manifest is designed to convert a person into cargo. That is its function. It has no column for a mother's name, no column for the village she was born in, the language she sang in, the God she prayed to that very morning before the raiders came. It has a column for a number and a column for a port. That is the machine at work. It takes a human being with a full and specific history and reduces the surviving record of them to where they were loaded and where they were sold. Everything that made them a particular someone from a particular somewhere is simply left off the page, as if it had never existed. And I have to keep saying this, because it is the truth, and because it keeps us out of the ditch that swallows so much of this conversation. This was a system, a trade, with investors and insurers and clerks and shareholders. It was not a race of people, it was a business, built to profit from human beings and to erase the evidence of where they began. I hold that line not to soften anything, but because it is accurate, and because accuracy is the only weapon in this fight that never turns in your hand and cuts you. The wound is real. The wound has a shape, and the shape is bookkeeping in the service of bondage. But here is the turn, the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that feels almost too fitting to be chance. The very erasure that Manifest performed is the thing those DNA studies now, partly and carefully, reverse. We are right at the middle of this now, and I want to pause and speak to you directly, the way you would if we were actually sitting across from each other at that table. If you have made it this far, you are not here for entertainment. You are here because something in this subject touches a real place in you, a place that maybe doesn't get touched very often. So let me ask you to do one small thing, and I promise you it is not empty. If this is landing, comment the word pattern. That is the word that holds this whole video. 3 records pointing one way, and I want to see it fill the comments so we can all watch the recognition happen together tonight. And tell me the city you are watching from. Type where you are, and if you are feeling it, add the word restored. I don't ask for that the way people ask for a hollow like or a quick tap. I ask because I genuinely believe there is something to seeing how many of us are carrying the same thing at the same time. A grandmother in Detroit, a young father in Atlanta, somebody watching alone in a kitchen in London, or in Kingston, or in a small town where they are the only ones who care about any of this. When you comment, you turn a solitary feeling into a shared one. And here is one more ask, and it is the one that matters most to me of all of them. If this reached you, pass it to one person in your family who has been carrying the blank, the one who always said, "We just don't know where we came from," and said it with a little shrug that never quite hid the ache. Send it to them, like you are handing over a record that was almost lost. Because that is exactly what it is. Now let me close this echo with the thing that keeps me up at night. The irony sitting right at the center of it all. The ledgers were written to condemn. They were the paperwork of a crime against millions. They were meant to reduce a human being to a number and a port, and then move on to the next entry. There was no tenderness in them, no thought of the future, no thought of the descendant who might one day come looking. And yet those very ledgers, preserved by the traders and their institutions for the ugliest and most self-interested reasons, are now among the evidence that helps hand a region back to a family.
The record that was built to erase your origin is now, in part, restoring your origins. I have never once gotten over that. It feels like something older than luck. Honestly, many of us in the Black Church would call it strained grace, the way God can take the very instrument mean for harm and turn it over century towards healing.
And I think that is a fair way to say it, as long as I say plainly that I am telling you how I read it, out of my own faith, not declaring it as a fact you must accept. You can be a hardened skeptic and still feel the weight of it. The tool of erasure became a tool of return. However you explain that, it is worth stopping over. But I want to stay disciplined even inside the wonder, because that is precisely where careful people keep their footing when everyone around them is losing theirs. The ledgers restore a region. The DNA studies report a region. Together they narrow the blank that the trade worked so hard to widen. They do not hand you a soul, a rank, or a destiny, and I will keep refusing to pretend they do, no matter how good it would feel to say otherwise. What they line up on is geography, an address, a coast, with a name. That is the honest prize, and I promise you it is enough. So hold those two witnesses, the ships and the science, in one hand, because now I'm going to put something in your other hand that is older than either of them, older than the trade, older than the ships. There is a third witness, and it was written down long before the first slave ship was ever built. Here is the thing the erasure needed you to forget, and it is so simple it is almost funny once you see it. The ancient writers never thought Africa was a blank. They knew it was full of nations. Long before any European ship map pretended the continent was a mystery to be labeled unknown, the oldest texts we have were naming African peoples by name, matter-of-factly, the way you would name a neighbor down the road. Open the Hebrew scriptures and you meet Cush, the region south of Egypt, that the Greeks later called Ethiopia. You meet Egypt itself, an African power that fills page after page. You meet Put, another African people, listed among the nations of the earth in the table of nations in Genesis. These were not exotic footnotes tucked in the margins. They were part of the known, mapped, named world. I want to say clearly what I am doing and not doing, because we are in Scripture now, and I refuse to overreach here of all places. I am giving you one careful reading of these texts, a reading I have sat with and prayed over and believe in, and one that many in the Black Church tradition have held for a very long time. I am not telling you it is the only reading. I am not telling you a verse is a genetics report, because it is not, and anyone who tells you it is has left honesty behind. What I am pointing at is something quieter, and I think harder to argue with. The oldest documents in our civilization treated African nations as real, named, present, woven into the story from the start. And then, many centuries later, a trade arose that needed those same origins to become unknowable. Sit in that sequence with me, because the order is the whole hinge. The naming came first, the blanking came after, and on purpose. There was a time when "Where are you from?" had a clear answer for these peoples, written into the sacred record of an entire civilization. Cush was Cush. Ethiopia stretched along the Upper Nile. Egypt was Egypt, a name every child in the ancient world knew. And then history ran a machine designed to take a person from exactly that world and deliver them to a plantation, with their origin scrubbed off the page. What the scripture assumed as obvious, the ledger deleted as inconvenient, and what the ledger deleted, the DNA study is now, in its careful and limited way, beginning to report back. Do you feel the shape of that? The same coast the scripture named, the same coast the ships loaded from, the same coast the 2020 study reported. The naming was there the whole time in the oldest layer, waiting under 2 centuries of deliberate silence. It never left the ancient text. It only left the plantation record, because the plantation needed it gone. Let me put one of those old lines in front of you, because it is more specific than most people expect. Psalm chapter 68, verse 31. Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God. Read it slowly, the way you'd read something you didn't want to miss. In the middle of a song about God's power over all the nations, The poet does not reach for a vague everyone, a generic all peoples. He names a specific African nation and places them in the story on purpose, reaching toward God with their own hands, on their own initiative. I've read that verse 100 times, and here is where I've landed, and I offer it as where I've landed, not as a ruling. Whatever else it means, it is not treating Ethiopia as a stranger wandering in from outside the story. It is naming an African people as belonging inside it, reaching toward God, as one of God's own. And I hold that as my reading, offered humbly with open hands, never as a proof about anybody's chromosomes. Now I have to show you something about words, because this is where a small choice by translators shaped how millions of people pictured the whole story for centuries. There is a Hebrew word, ger. It means a sojourner, a resident foreigner, someone dwelling among a people who are not originally their own. It is a real and important word, and the scriptures use it with genuine care, often to command kindness toward the outsider. But here is what I have come to understand, and I say come to understand on purpose, because it honestly took me years to see it. In the long history of rendering these texts into English, the idea of the outsider, the stranger, sometimes got laid over peoples the text had already named as present and belonging. The specific quietly became the generic. The named became the stranger. Let me be careful and precise about who did what, because vague accusation is exactly the trap I refuse to fall into on this channel. I am not telling you a shadowy they schemed in the dark to hurt anyone. I am telling you that translation is a long series of choices, made by real people in real centuries, working with the assumptions of their own time, and that choices carry consequences down through the generations. When a translator reaches for a generic word where the text is actually naming a known African people, the English reader inherits a picture, an outsider drifting in from the margins, rather than a nation seated inside the story. That is not a claim about anyone's heart or motive. It is a claim about a word, and words shape what we see. One reading among the tradition's many, and this is the one I find most faithful to the older text. And do you feel the rhyme with everything we've already seen tonight? This is the same motion as the ledger, just performed with ink instead of chains. The ledger took a specific person from a specific coast and reduced them to a number and a port. The flattening in translation took a specific named people and reduced them, in the English imagination, to a generic stranger passing through. Different centuries, different tools, different intentions even, but the same direction of travel. From named to nameless, from present to peripheral, from someone with an address to someone from nowhere in particular. I sit with that overlap, and I don't think it is simply an accident of history. But I hold even that carefully, as how I read it, not as a charge I can prove against anyone. Here, though, is the mercy the erasure could never fully reach, and it changes everything. The older manuscripts kept the naming. They were copied and recopied by hand, carried into the mountains of Ethiopia, preserved in Greek and in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopian scripture, guarded in monasteries that outlasted empires. And in those older layers, the specific names survived intact. You can still go back today and read Kush as Kush, Ethiopia as Ethiopia, the African nation seated inside the story, rather than shuffled quietly to its edge. Think about how remarkable that is. The trade could scrub a plantation record clean. It could burn a name off a bill of sale. It could beat a language out of a child. But it could not reach back across the whole world and unwrite every ancient manuscript ever copied. The scrolls were too many, too scattered, too well guarded, too old. The memory outran the eraser. And that sets up the exact moment I've been building toward this entire video. The moment all three witnesses finally stand together in one frame. Because there is one verse where the oldest manuscript tradition says the quiet part out loud, plainly, in Greek. And it is exactly where we go next. This is the verse, Amos chapter 9, verse 7. And I need you to hear it in two versions, because the difference between them is the whole reason this channel exists. In most English Bibles, God says to Israel, Are you not like the children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel? Already that is striking. God comparing his own covenant people to an African nation, putting them on the same footing, refusing to let Israel imagine itself as uniquely special above the Cushites. But go back to the older Greek manuscript tradition, the Septuagint, the translation that Greek-speaking Jews were reading and praying from centuries before the King James was ever imagined. And in that ancient reading, the line lands even more directly. It renders them, in the Greek, as sons of the Ethiopians. Huai Ethiopan, sons of the Ethiopians. Say that again slowly. Sons of the Ethiopians. Not compared to, not like. Sons of. The oldest translation we have foregrounds an African naming that later English versions softened into a simple comparison. And I want you to notice that the Septuagint is not some fringe document. It was the Bible of the early church. It is what many of the New Testament writers themselves quoted. When the earliest Christians read Amos, this is the phrasing many of them held in their hands. Let me tell you plainly how I hold this, because I will not let wonder push me 1 inch into overclaiming, not even here at the height of the video. This is a manuscript, reading. It is a fact about words on ancient pages, about how the Greek text phrases the verse, and it is checkable by anyone who wants to open a Septuagint and look for themselves. It is not a biology report. It is not me telling you a chromosome test confirms a Bible verse, or that a Bible verse confirms a chromosome test. Those are two entirely different kinds of evidence, and I refuse to smear them together to make a bigger emotional splash. What I am showing you is narrower, and to me, more beautiful precisely because it is narrow. The oldest translation puts an African people at the center. The manuscript said, Ethiopia first. And do you see what that does to the softening we just walked through? Where later English readers inherited a picture of the African as the stranger drifting in from outside the family. The older Greek manuscript places an African people right at the center of God's own speech, as sons, as kin, as belonging by name. Many of us in the Black Church have read Amos 9:7 this way for a long time, and felt the ground shift under our feet when we did. I offer it to you exactly that way, as a reading, a treasured one, held with open hands, not hammered down as the final word for every believer everywhere. But I will not pretend it is a small thing. It is not small. It is the third witness stepping into the room. So now let me do the thing I promised you at the very beginning. Back at that kitchen table, let me lay all 3 witnesses side by side in a single frame and let you look at them together. Because that is the only way the pattern was ever going to show itself. And you have earned the seeing. Witness 1, the 2020 study in the American Journal of Human Genetics, drawing on tens of thousands of people, reporting that African American ancestry traces largely to West and West Central Africa, to Senegambia and the Bight of Benin, and the coast, running down toward Congo and Angola. Witness 2, the slave ship database at slavevoyages.org, tens of thousands of documented voyages, the traders' own manifests naming those same stretches of coast as the regions of embarkation. Witness 3, the manuscript reading, older than both by centuries, the Septuagint of Amos 9:7, naming an African people as sons, seated inside the story, long before a single slave ship was ever built. Now look at them together. Really look. 3 records, a geneticist's data from this decade, a slave trader's ledger from 3 centuries ago, a Greek scribe's manuscript from before the time of Christ. 3 witnesses who never met, who could not possibly have met, who had no way to coordinate their testimony and every reason in the world not to. And they point the same direction. This is not one voice shouting into an empty room. This is 3 strangers spread across 2,000 years, describing the same coastline and the same belonging. I've laid a lot of evidence in front of a lot of people over the years, and I can tell you honestly, agreement like this, between sources that never touched, is rare. It is the exact thing that makes a careful person stop and sit up straight. And I want to be honest about what convinced me, because I did not come to this quickly. For a long time, I was wary of laying a Bible verse next to a genetic study at all, because I have watched people do it badly, jamming the two together to manufacture a certainty neither one can carry alone. I went back and forth on whether to even put them in the same video. Where I finally landed is this. I am not fusing them. I am not saying one proves the other. I am setting three separate records on the same table and letting you notice, for yourself, that they lean the same way. The science stays science. The manuscript stays manuscript. The ledger stays ledger. What they share is not a mechanism. It is a direction. So let me name the pattern out loud, because you have earned the naming and I've made you wait for it. This is not accident. This is restoration. Not a blank, but an address. Not a stranger drifting in from the margins, but a people named and seated in the story. Not random suffering with no root and no meaning, but a root the erasure reached for and could not finally pull up. Three records converging is not a coincidence you can wave away with a tired hand. It is a pattern, and I want that word, pattern, to be the one thing you carry out of this video and into your week, because it is the honest shape of what these three witnesses do when you finally stop reading them one at a time and read them together. But hear me, especially now, at the loudest moment, because this is exactly the place where people go too far, and I refuse to. A study reports geography. It does not decree your identity. It does not rank your soul before God. It does not hand you a destiny sealed in your blood, and I will say it as plainly and as flatly as I possibly can, so there is no room to twist it. Your DNA does not prove you are any particular biblical people. I don't believe that sentence. I would never sell it to you, and I would not say it even here, even with all three witnesses stacked on the table in front of us. That kind of claim is exactly where truth curdles into a trap, and I've watched it trap good people. So let me tell you what I do believe the pattern actually restores, because it is quieter and it will outlast every loud claim. It restores the dignity of a named origin. It takes the word unknown, the word the trade worked so hard and so long to stamp on your family's record, and it lays a real region down beside it. A coast, a people, a place your ancestors could have pointed to and called home before anyone ever came for them. That is what three witnesses give back, not destiny in the blood, dignity in the record. And that dignity, that simple returned address, is exactly what they tried hardest to erase, and could not. So let me bring this home to you, the one actually watching. Because everything we've walked through tonight was heading toward this moment. For most of American history, a black family, reaching back for where we came from, hit a wall 2 centuries deep. The record said unknown. The story stopped cold at a port, and a person could grow up feeling like a guest in their own history, written in near the end of the book, with no first chapter of their own, no opening page, no before. But look at what these three witnesses do when you finally hold them together. They do not hand you a slogan to chant. They hand you a documented place inside a documented story. The 2020 study reported a region. The ship's records named it. The oldest manuscript seated an African people inside the sacred account long before any of it happened. You were not a latecomer to this story. According to the records, we can actually open and check. Your people were in the story early and named. And I want to keep my discipline even in the tender part, because you deserve honesty far more than you deserve a rush of feeling that fades by morning. The science does not hand you a soul, or a rank, or a secret status. It reports a region, and the region has a history, a deep and dignified one, older than the trade that tried to sever you from it, full of kingdoms and languages and art and faith. I'm not going to tell you what that region means about your worth, because your worth was never once up for a laboratory to decide. What I will tell you is what the records show, and then I'll let you carry the meaning yourself, in your own hands, at your own kitchen table, in your own time. That is the respectful way, and I've come to believe it is the only honest one. Here is the restoration, said as plainly as I know how to say it. It is the movement from one word to another word, from unknown on a ledger to a named region on a report. That is the whole miracle, and I promise you, it is enough. Think for a moment about how hard they worked to keep that first word, unknown, locked in place, the stripped name, the forbidden tongue, the manifest, with no column for home. The generations of deliberate blanking, repeated so many times it became the background of a whole people's life. And it failed. Sit with that. After all of it, the erasure did not finally hold. The record outlived the ones who tried to write you out of it. Say that slowly with me. The record outlived the eraser. That is the line I want you to keep and carry. They spent centuries trying to make your origin unspeakable, and a swab and a database and an old manuscript are speaking it anyway. Quietly, stubbornly, from 3 directions at once. Not because your blood is magic, I won't tell you that, but because the truth is stubborn, and because records, once they truly survive, are very hard to unwrite. I've sat with that stubbornness for a long time, and honestly, it steadies me on the hard days. What was almost lost is being handed back, one named region at a time, to families who had stopped expecting it. And I want you to think about what actually sits behind those region names, because this is where the restoration stops being a word on a screen and becomes something with weight. Senegambia was not an empty coast. It held kingdoms and scholars and centuries of trade, long before any European ship arrived. The Bight of Benin, West Central Africa toward the Congo. These were homes to great civilizations, to art and metalwork and oral libraries carried in the minds of people whose whole vocation was to remember. When a study reports that your ancestry traces to one of those coasts, it is not handing you a blank patch of jungle from someone's imagination. It is handing you back an address inside a civilization, one that was thriving while your ancestors were still free. I hold that as reported findings paired with documented history, not as a claim about your soul, but I will not let anyone shrink it into something small either. And here is what moves me most when I sit with it late at night. The people who kept those ledgers assumed the erasure was permanent. They could not have imagined a machine that reads the inside of a cheek, or a database anyone could open from a phone, or that the manuscripts they never bothered to destroy would still be sitting in the mountains of Ethiopia, waiting. They built the blank to last forever. It did not last forever. Many of us in the Black Church would say, that is exactly the kind of thing God does with what was meant for harm. And I believe that, though I say it as my faith and not as a fact I can hand you across the table, the erasure had a deadline it never knew about, and we are living past it. Now, before I pray with you, and before I ask anything of you, I have to say the most important sentence in this whole video, and I need you to hear it as carefully as you've heard everything else. What I've shared with you tonight is one reading of these texts, one I've sat with, prayed over, and believe in deeply. The Christian tradition holds many interpretations of these same passages, and I encourage you to study them, and to study these scientific findings too, with your own pastor and your own heart, and to come to your own convictions honestly. And let me be just as clear about the science as I am about the scripture. The genetics I described are reported findings from named, dated, peer-reviewed studies. They are not a verdict on any soul, not a certificate of destiny, and not proof of who anyone truly is before God. Hold the evidence as evidence, gratefully and carefully. Hold your identity as something no report on earth could ever grant you or take away. Both of those can be true at the very same time. And I believe, with everything in me, that they are. Before we close, let me ask you for a few things, and not one of them is empty or automatic. If this video handed you something tonight, comment the word pattern, and right next to it, the city you are watching from. I mean that. I read them, and there was something real in seeing how many of us are carrying the same recognition on the same night. From Detroit to Houston to London to Kingston to some small town where you thought you were the only one. That word, pattern, is the whole point of what we did here. 3 records pointing one way, and I want the comments to read like a map of everyone who finally saw it for themselves. And if you have carried the blank a long time, if you have lived under that word unknown. Add the word restored. Let it be the first time you get to say it out loud and mean it. And subscribe, not for the algorithm, and not to run up a number, but because the next record goes deeper than this one. There is always another witness to bring to the table. Another manuscript reading held in a mountain monastery. Another study. Another line the erasure reached for and missed. I've come to believe this work is a long walk, not a single video you watch once and forget, and I would be genuinely honored to keep walking it alongside you. Then do the one thing that matters most of all. Take this and hand it to someone in your own family who always said, "We just don't know where we came from." Send it to them like you are passing along a record that was almost lost forever. Because for your grandchildren, and their grandchildren, that is exactly what it will become. Pass the address to the next generation. That is how a thing that was merely erased turns into something a family keeps and hands down. And let me say one thing to you directly, the way I would if you were sitting right here with me. If you have spent your whole life feeling like your story started on a plantation, like there was nothing before, no first page, no home, I want to speak something specific over you tonight. What we looked at does not fill in every name. It cannot. 2 centuries of deliberate silence do not undo in an evening. But it takes that flat word unknown, and it puts a real coast beside it. A coast with kingdoms and language and faith older than the ships. You are not the beginning of your family's story. You are a chapter deep inside a long one. I believe that, and I believe the records, read carefully, quietly say the same. Now let me pray with you wherever you are, whatever kind of night it's been. Father, we thank you tonight for truth, and for the strange mercy that can take even a cruel record and turn it, over long centuries, toward restoration. We thank you that you are the God of all the nations, of every people, and every tongue, and every coastline, that no one is a stranger to you, and no one stands above another in your sight. We hold that first, before anything else, and then, inside that, we thank you for the specific gift of this night, for origins handed back where they were nearly lost, for names surfacing out of 2 centuries of forced silence, for records that somehow survived the very ones who tried to write your children out of the story altogether. We ask you to guard the ones watching who felt something crack open in them tonight. Steady them, Lord. Let the dignity of a named origin settle down into them, without pride and without fear, without turning hard toward anyone. Let it make them rooted and gentle, grateful and generous, the way a person is when they finally know where they stand. And for anyone still carrying only the blank, still holding nothing but that cold word unknown, we ask that in time, in your own timing, a piece of their story would find its way home to them too. We pray this, trusting your justice, even when it feels slow to arrive, and trusting your kindness, which we have seen tonight in an old manuscript and a modern study quietly saying the same true thing. So here is where I leave you, and I'll keep it simple, the way the strongest things almost always are. You were not written out of the story. The record outlived the ones who tried to end it. What the ledger called unknown, the coast still remembers, and the old manuscript named it long before the first ship ever sailed from that shore. Not destiny sealed in your blood. I will not hand you that. Not even now. Something better and truer and sturdier. A home region returned to the record. A name given back where a blank used to sit. Carry it gently. Teach it to your children and your children's children. Walk seeing. Walk hopeful. Amen.